Hi, this is Lorraine Watry, and this is part 3 of Watercolor Techniques for Beginners. And this is a repeat or refilm of my original watercolor techniques so that I could improve it and hopefully make it easier to follow along. So we finished the last video with scratching wet and dry, and it is something we're still watching because in order to do the lighter lines, we have to come back when it's a little drier. What I'm showing you right there is the Magic Clean eraser, and that's part of one of those erasers. And they're actually a household kitchen supply, but because of what the sponge is made of, they are great for lifting. They don't have any chemicals in them from what the company says. They are chemical free, and as long as you buy the ones that don't have detergents or things in them, just the basic magic eraser, then you can use it on your watercolor paper. So I took some tape and I covered part of the watercolor there, and then I noticed that it was starting to get to the point where I could come back into that scratching area, and because the paint is starting to dry enough, I was able to lift some white lines. Those are a little harder to see, but you want the shine of the paper to almost be completely gone, and then you can scrape before it's completely dry and get light white lines. So now I'm going back over to the Magic Eraser section, and I wet the sponge, and then I just start pulling that color back off, just scrubbing it a little bit. And you want to make sure you're using good quality watercolor paper. Some watercolor papers, even if they are an artist professional quality, could still possibly have problems using the eraser. It may pull up the surface of the paper. So you want to make sure you test that before you use the eraser in something. And then you can also use the Magic Eraser sponge by just lifting the color without putting any tape around it first. So you're just softening an area and causing it to lighten back up with softer edges. So that's what I did on that other side there. Now we're going to move on to the salt area, and salt can become a little overused sometimes in paintings, but it's a fun texture to use, for instance, on stucco walls and things like that. And you also have to have, just like we did in the scratching wet and dry, you have to have the right consistency of paint before you put the salt on that area. It has to almost be dry. It has to be losing a lot of the shine of the wet watercolor before you apply the salt. So when I put my paint on there, I have sort of a greener side, and then I pulled some blue from another section on my palette and just sort of did a mix of color there. And then I am watching it, and I am looking for the shine as it starts to disappear a little bit. And I decided it was starting to dry a little bit on that left-hand side. When you do use the salt, you want to apply it and then let that area dry completely before you knock any of the salt crystals off. And what should happen is the salt is basically wicking up the color, and you will end up with these lighter areas where it sort of gives a little almost star-like look to the area that's pulled up. So while the other side is drying a little bit, I believe I go on to do the water splatter and bloom area. I paint on some color there, and then I am going to flick on some water with my fingers. So I've gone back and I've put some salt on the other side of that area of the salt technique. It had dried enough that I could then stop and do that. And you can already see the salt on the left-hand side is starting to lift color off, and it's getting a little lighter in those areas. So I'm watching the water splatter and bloom area. That too is one of the techniques that you want to start to dry a little bit before you add more water to that area. And that is a sea sponge. And while those other two things are taking their time to dry, I am going to use the sea sponge, and I dab it in several different colors on my palette, and by turning it and twisting it and using different parts of the sponge, you can get great texture that is wonderful for trees and bushes and other kinds of textures that you just need a random pattern. So I'm still watching the water and splatter areas. I probably went a little early, but you can see I splashed on some water there, and you can sort of see some little blooms occurring right away. And that's where the wetter water that I put on is pushing the other color back from itself. The wetter area will want to push into the drier area. So that's something that you should be aware of when you're painting. You need to be constantly aware of how much water is on your brush, so that if you're coming up next to an area that's already starting to dry, you don't come next to it with something that's really wet if you don't want a bloom. Sometimes people like to have blooms occur, and so then if you practice this and learn the technique of having a wetter area next to the drier area, you can create blooms. So I put on sort of a little bit of a blue-purple color there, and I continued to put a little bit of water into that so that I could get that bloom to start pushing back on the drier color. And then I actually noticed that some of my techniques that I had done earlier had created blooms, and so that's what I'm showing you there. And so now we're going to go down to some of the last techniques. We still have a few we need to finish up that we started, but at the bottom of the page here, I'm going to show you opaque versus transparent paint. And this isn't necessarily a technique, although depending on what you're painting, you might want something to have more of an opaque look or a transparent look. So I'm going to let that marker line that I just drew dry, and I'm going over to the sandpaper and watercolor pencil area. I need to put on either a wash of color, or I could just put on clear water. And then right there I'm taking rough sandpaper and I'm taking a pencil, and it's a watercolor pencil, and I scrape the watercolor pencil onto the sandpaper, and it takes off little tiny pieces of the watercolor pencil. And then I switch to a different color there. Maybe you'd be able to see that one better. And you can see how it leaves a texture that's got very interesting little tiny specks of color. And so that is a great thing to use for in foliage and things like that. Add some interest to an area. Some of the watercolor pencil will disperse just a little bit, so that some of it will be softer edged and some of it will be a little bit harder edged. But you want to do that on an area that's wet. If you need to add some water over the top of a color that you already have down, you can also do it that way. Okay, so we're going over to the opaque versus transparent section, and I am going to use some cadmium red to go over that area, and you can see that that opaque paint covers over that marker line pretty strongly, and you can't see the line as well. And then I will reach in and pull some permanent rose out, and you will be able to see the permanent rose. You can still see the line through the permanent rose because it's more of a transparent paint. And I actually have my two colors switched. I should have put the opaque cadmium red under opaque, but you can just redraw as I did with a marker. I marked it off. So this is the finish of part 3 of 4, and when we come back, I will finish up the techniques that we started earlier, and I hope you have enjoyed. Thanks for watching. Bye.